So welcome back, and welcome to those who are joining us online for this second panel, The Current Challenges Facing Human Rights Philanthropy. It is a real pleasure for me to introduce Larry Cox, whom I first met when I was a 15-year-old high school intern at Amnesty International here in New York. Larry spent 20 years at Amnesty International in various positions, serving as Deputy Secretary General in London's International Secretariat, and later as Executive Director of Amnesty International USA here in New York. In between, he worked for 11 years as Senior Program Officer for Human Rights at the Ford Foundation, where he worked to expand funding for international justice, economic, social, and cultural rights, and human rights in the United States. I'm also proud to say that Larry is teaching here at Roosevelt House, helping us educate the next generation of human rights advocates. I also want to thank Larry for helping us put this conference together and for chairing this panel. Please welcome Larry Cox, and he will introduce the panel. Thank you.
Welcome everybody. I'm so glad to see this many people here. You always worry if you're the panel after lunch that people will go take a nap or just not come back at all. But fortunately the first panel was good, so it seems to be the reason that people are taking a chance on this one. We're going to shift, as you know, from looking at the past, that was often glorious, to looking at the present, which is often problematic. Our four, very distinguished panelists, and I can call them that because I've actually worked with them over the years, are, as Jessica just said, going to lead us in a discussion of the current challenges to human rights and how philanthropies are or should be helping to meet those challenges. And I think a discussion about the current challenges to human rights is a discussion that I think you'll agree could not be more urgent. It's also, in my opinion, a discussion that if it's done honestly could not be more difficult and maybe even painful. It's urgent because, as others have already noted, our discussion on current challenges to human rights is taking place as on our TVs and other devices we are watching every day, literally watching massive and horrific human rights violations and war crimes inflicting indescribable suffering on men, women, and children in the Ukraine. But even if the invasion of the Ukraine had not taken place, I think this discussion on current challenges to human rights would be a difficult and painful one, because we are currently facing challenges to human rights that have never seemed so intractable, so difficult to overcome. As we always do, we still see from Belarus to Hong Kong, from Myanmar to Russia, from Sudan to Brazil, from states all over the United States to Cuba, we see amazing, courageous, and inspiring uprisings of people who are fighting, often risking their lives, fighting for their rights. But we also see time and time and time again in the past few years, in the past decade, we see that these critical fights for rights are, if not crushed, they are often stopped and severely repressed, and by those who remain in power without ever being held accountable for what they've done. So before we begin our discussion, and I'm not going to take very long before that, I think it's just important to remember, as others like Arya have already noted, that it was not always like this. There, of course, have always been challenges to human rights and terrible violations of those rights all around the world. But there was also a time, beginning especially in the early 80s and into the 90s, when the whole world saw that the power of the idea of human rights, when it's combined with the mobilization of people pressure, both within and without countries, that power can have really astounding success. I often tell people that when I'm giving a talk that to my mind, the human rights movement has been the most successful social movement of my lifetime. In just one decade, you recall, we saw the fall of the Berlin Wall, apartheid in South Africa, and brutal dictatorships from the Philippines to the southern cone of Latin America. And those victories made it possible to imagine that there were even deeper and broader victories that could be won, that maybe we could get at racial and economic injustice, that maybe we could have human rights be applied even to superpowers like the United States, and maybe we could develop mechanisms and systems that would prevent violations before they begin, rather than simply always documenting and responding. That didn't happen the way we imagined, as we all know. And as we heard Michelle Bachelet say earlier today, and as she said well before the invasion of Ukraine a year ago, we are now living, in her words, facing, quote, the most wide-reaching and severe cascade of human rights setbacks in our lifetimes, end of quote. Fewer and fewer governments are mentioning their commitment to human rights, let alone showing signs that they take those commitments seriously. Autocracies are spreading, democracies are shrinking, and according to the UN, inequality is growing for more than 70% of the global population. And there's been a lot, and we've heard some of it already, a lot of very important, very good work on human rights since the 80s and the 90s. But I think we have to acknowledge that it's also true that something has gone wrong with the fight, in the fight to advance human rights. And I don't think there's any easy or quick way to figure out exactly what that something is. I think it would take a lot more conferences to even begin. And I don't think we're going to solve the question in this panel, as brilliant as my colleagues are. But I think perhaps the best way to at least move forward is to begin to identify one by one some of the major obstacles that are blocking the advancement of human rights, and then begin to explore new and even bold ways that funders might help activists and others to overcome those obstacles. And that's what we're going to try to do in the next couple of hours. Fortunately, we have on our panel some of the great people with really extensive experience who can begin to help us think about this question. So we're going to begin this discussion. I'm going to ask each one of our panelists, starting with Martine, then Akwazi, who's with us on, there he is, with us on video, then Gabby, and then Gara. I'm going to ask each one of them to take what they see as a major obstacle to advancing human rights and talk about it, and maybe indicate also ways that they think funders could help to overcome it. And then we'll follow that up with another round where we'll try to go a little deeper into what they say, and maybe also mention some obstacles that haven't been covered yet, so that are still very important and major. And then I hope we will, of course, open it up, both to people who are listening online and especially to you. And I just want to say you don't have to just ask questions. You can also make comments. even hostile comments, if you want. I think that's a way to begin to get a real sort of conversation coming. And also, I realize that there are people sitting here who know more, certainly than I do, about what has gone wrong or what has gone right with the movement for human rights. So with that said, I want to begin by asking Martin to take 5 to 10 minutes and talk about what he sees from his perspective as one of the major obstacles, what it has been and what it is now, to advancing human rights.
Thank you, Larry, and good afternoon to everyone. And thank you again for the organizers for inviting us to be part of this conversation. And, you know,
I forgot. I also would just like you to take a minute or so just to introduce who your thing is in the program, but tell us who you are. And
okay. Now you're beginning to sound like Mike Shrink. I don't know. Okay, so I'm Martín Abregu. I'm the Vice President for International Programs with the Ford Foundation. I've been working on and off with the human rights issues for my entire professional career. Began working with a human rights organization in my home country, Argentina, and been doing different things around human rights movement and human rights work since then. Trained as a lawyer originally, but I can't consider a lawyer myself anymore. So I think that when defining what are the challenges related to human rights movement today is an extremely challenging question, because of course each of us will have a very different understanding, and those different understandings had to do with our own focuses and concerns. But let me at least propose 2 or 3 things that I think come together, and then maybe we can start answering the question of what do we do about it. I think that there is no doubt that the current trend that we can define as increasing authoritarianism or democracy backsliding is a major challenge for human rights work, right? We are seeing that all over the place. And Larry, you were saying, like, only a couple of decades ago, we were certain that democracy was winning the cultural war. And today, the picture looks extremely different. And I think that I want to stress that because, it definitely, the human rights movement was, in many respects, a movement that always thought about progress, not about obstacles of moving backward, and we are struggling to respond to this situation. The second one, I think, is what I would call the unfulfilled promise of human rights for all. If you look at how many people have been benefiting from human rights in the last 30 or 40 years, you don't see that there has been like an exponential growth in terms of the number of people benefiting from human rights. I would actually argue that we all thought that we were moving into a process that more and more people were going to have their right protected, and that actually never happened. It's still a relatively small group of people most of them in a relatively small group of countries that can actually enjoy human rights, right? And I always use the example of a social justice leader in a favela in Brazil who once said, like, oh, human rights, yes, to me, human rights is like caviar, right? Like, people say it's great, but I never tasted it, right? It's like, there is this sense for a lot of people that they never really had a sense of what human rights look like, right? And this unfulfilled promise, I think, is one of the huge challenges for the human rights movement. And it's not about enforcement, I would say, it's about accessibility. And I think we can make that distinction. And I think that the third piece that makes all these things complicated is it's a global order in disarray, right? Basically, the international human rights movement depended a lot on a specific global order that put human rights at the center. That global order doesn't exist the way it used to, and we are all struggling to find our way to engage around human rights issues and with human rights authoritarian states when we don't have that kind of global order that will help us doing that. So actually, promoting and protecting human rights in a multipolar world is much more challenging than promoting and protecting human rights in a bipolar or unipolar world, right? So, and of course, these three things are very much connected to each other, right? It's like, of course, the authoritarianism had to do with, as we were saying, with the global order, the fact that the failure to deliver human rights is also connected with democracy backsliding, and all of these things come together in very challenging ways. So, what we have been doing at Ford for the last 5 or so years have been mostly focusing around this idea of human rights for all, and how do we expand the number of people who benefit from human rights. And actually, part of the challenge there is that when you focus on this idea of human rights for all, you do not necessarily end up funding the traditional human rights players. Basically, you need to stop thinking about traditional human rights in the traditional way and the traditional players, and you need to start thinking about human rights from the perspective of, Afro-descendants in Latin America, or people with disabilities, or indigenous people, or how do you link it with climate change, or et cetera, et cetera. So this question of centering human rights instead of actually focusing on an international human rights movement per se. And that has been a huge challenge. We can talk more about that. I will argue that the process has been an interesting one and a promising one. But of course, there is this huge gap between what we could call the expressive human rights culture, the fact that more and more people are asking for human rights, and the backsliding of human rights institutions in the sense of being unable to respond to that challenge. So a lot of our work has been in working at that gap, right, between that and so anyway, I can elaborate on that, but I think I may stop here.
Okay, that was a good start, I think. So, Kwasi, can you take up one of the challenges that you see in impeding human rights?
Yeah, thank you very much. And sorry I can't make it in person. I'll try to be brief. My name is Akwasi Edu. I'm currently Senior Fellow at Humanity United, where I've been for the last 8 years. I'm Ghanaian, American, and my engagement with human rights work goes back to the late 1960s when I was an undergraduate at the university in Ghana, and when ASU was established. ASU is the Pan-African Students' Union, which was heavily engaged in human rights activism and also in the anti-apartheid movement. And then, of course, professionally, I worked at IDRC, the Canadian Government Funding Agency, on the right to health. My PhD is in medical sociology, focused on the right to health. And then joined the Ford Foundation in 1992 and headed the Ford office in West Africa, again, focusing more on human rights and democratic governance. I sit on a few human rights organizations boards, including Human Rights Watch. And I was on many of the boards, chaired 3 of the boards of Open Society foundations. So I've been engaged in the human rights field for about 52 years of my 72 years on Earth. And it's very close to my heart. I will highlight 3 main points. The first, which you all know and you've spoken about, is that the most egregious abuses of human rights are often in conflict zones. So that's what I'll focus on, especially in places of armed conflict, such as Somalia, Ukraine now, South Sudan, Afghanistan, Mali, Syria, Guinea, Northeast Nigeria, Cameroon, DR Congo, and many more that you know across the world. And the second point I'll make is that there are a number of major challenges that face human rights philanthropy, and I'll highlight 5 of them. The first is always the perception of interference and suffering reprisals when foundations, philanthropic institutions, engage in human rights funding, especially those that are from the global north, west. The second challenge, which again we all know, is the inaccessibility to grassroots organizations and marginalized communities in those places. Because often the philanthropic institutions, the grant-making organizations do not have their feet on the ground. Some of them, like the Ford Foundation, has field offices across the world, but most don't. The third is really, even when they have their feet on the ground, is minimal contextual knowledge. You don't speak the language. Often it's fly in, fly out. Often you have staff. When I joined the Ford Foundation in 1992, I was the only African internationally recruited. And that gives you an example of it, where people come in and they're working in a context that they barely understand how the context dynamics work out. The third, or rather the fourth challenge that human rights philanthropy faces now, and it's not new, is that there's often minimal attention given to the protection of human rights activists on the ground. And the last one is inadequate funding. When I've done the statistics, I've checked the statistics, the data, and there is inadequate protection funding for refugees, those who have to escape from conflict zones. Now, what are the opportunities? And here I'll draw, none of this is new to anybody, but I'll draw on hindsights and insights and foresights, things that we dream about, things we've done, and things we are doing across the field of philanthropy for human rights. And I'll mention 5 of them very quickly. The first is local re-granting foundations. And this is very important. As I explained earlier, contextual knowledge and having your feet on the ground. And the good news is that there are many re-granting foundations, institutions being established. And the Ford Foundation has been at the forefront of this. And Martin, I'm sure, can speak to that. When you look at the African context, for example, in terms of human rights funding, the Ford Foundation, when I joined, and soon later when I joined it, realized that even though it had its feet on the ground, it needed somehow to engage local philanthropists and local re-granting organizations. It helped to seed KCDF. KCDF is the Kenya Community Development Foundation, and it's really focused on human rights in marginalized communities. That was way back in the early 1990s. It was very instrumental in seeding again the establishment of AWDF, the Africa Women's Development Fund, which is based in Accra, Ghana. And then, of course, Trust Africa, which I helped to incubate in New York, in the New York office, and established in 2006, and I led until 2014, 8 years after which I handed over to a younger person. And Trust Africa is still alive, has substantial resources, and does a lot of re-granting work. And I'll come back to that in a minute. The other point, or rather opportunity, is donor collaboratives. Coming together always helps. It's a great opportunity to really manage how one deals with all the issues, challenges in conflict zones. And one example, and Mary Page will speak to this, that was the first time I got to meet her, got to know her when she was at the MacArthur Foundation, when a special multi-donor fund was established through their initiative, through Trust Africa, on international criminal justice. And that brought in the Ford Foundation, it brought in Open Society Foundations, the Justice Initiative, it brought in the Oak Foundation, the Cigarette Rousing Foundation, it brought in 12, over a dozen foundations. And that helped a lot to seed, or rather to re-grant to organizations in Sudan, in South Sudan, in Somalia, in Zimbabwe, places where, you know, external donors couldn't go, and in fact, even including African foundations like the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. So that was very helpful, and it's something to bear in mind going forward. The third, and two more, and I'll be done. The third opportunity, of course, is participatory grant making, and that was spoken about this morning. And I used to chair the board, and Gara knows this. I used to chair the board of the Fund for Global Human Rights. And of course, the Fund for Global Human Rights is another major re-granting institution that the Ford Foundation played a key role in helping to set up. And when I was the chair, the whole idea of participatory grant making came up. And you know this, so I won't go into the details of it. There's one good way of ensuring that the challenge of being seen as an external Western colonial type funder is addressed, and the whole thing becomes a lot more organic. And the last, well, two more. One is the whole thing, or the whole point about connecting, focusing a bit more on the intersection of peace and rights. And often that's missing. So connecting with peace building initiatives, something that Humanity United is actively engaged in South Sudan, that I'm helping with through co-creation, accompaniment, working with the On Yoke Foundation based in South Africa, and helping to build, or rather strengthen, young peace builders who are also seriously focusing on human rights protection and gender equity issues, and so on. And then the last point I'll make on opportunities is there are opportunities right in our face, in our faces. You go to Minnesota, you know, if you want to really work in Sudan, I mean, in Somalia, for example, where you cannot escape Minnesota. Minnesota, the diaspora, the Somali diaspora, is very actively engaged for and against war in Somalia. So, you know, you engage those who are for it, engage those who are against it. Strategically, tactically, you can make progress. I think my 10 minutes is up. I have a lot more to say. As we say in Ghana, before I speak, I want to say something. So I can go on to the very end on that note. Over back to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. You had a lot to say, but everything you said was itself could lead to even more to say. So we'll come back. Gabby, say a little word about yourself, and then.
Thank you, Larry. I'm Gabby Oreaguilar. I'm a program officer with Wellspring Philanthropic Fund. I've been working in and with the women's rights movements, the economic and social rights movements, for more than 2 decades. I manage currently a portfolio on women's rights and economic justice. So I work at the intersection of two of the major challenges confronting human rights: the entrenched gender inequality and the persistent neglect of economic and social rights. To do justice to each of these two challenges, I think we need more than 5 minutes, but so I will concentrate and focus my remarks on the challenge of advancing socioeconomic justice for women in the context of the pandemic and the post-pandemic. So there's abundant evidence about the deeply gendered and racialized impact of the pandemic around the world. The pandemic devastated the economically disadvantaged communities, especially women of color, girls, and indigenous women around the world. According to the Global Gender Gap report from 2021, the pandemic has set back the goal of achieving gender equality or gender parity for a whole generation to 135 years. And it was already 99 years before the pandemic. So not only did women lose jobs, more jobs than men, but also they performed the bulk of the healthcare work. 70% of healthcare work was performed by women. And they are 88% of healthcare workers, open personal healthcare workers. So the burden of unpaid care work also increased globally. And women already performed 76% of the unpaid care work before the pandemic. Girls dropped out of school in larger proportions than boys. And gender-based violence increased in communities around the world during the pandemic. So at the beginning of the crisis, progressive economic responses from governments seemed to indicate that there was an inclination to adopt policies that could fundamentally shift the highly gendered nature of the labor market and the economy in general. And that they would move to ensure that people, the well-being of people was at the center of the economy and the planet care, the planet well-being. But, and so advocates really thought that there was an opportunity. They thought that there was an opportunity to confront the root causes of the problems that the pandemic had exacerbated. However, 2 years on, domestic and international policy trends are telling us a different story. The fiscal space of countries, and especially developing countries, are reducing the fiscal spaces. There is no political willingness to invest on gender-just care systems, to maintain public care services and social protection measures, to achieve decent jobs, especially for women in the global south. So the pandemic really has highlighted that the challenges is not really the lack of resources. The main challenge to seek for solutions is really the lack of political will to distribute resources more equitably. Over the first year of the pandemic, in which millions of people were pushed out of work and into extreme poverty, the wealth concentration also increased. So that tells us that story. So overall, the human rights of those most economically marginalized or socioeconomically marginalized, especially women and girls, are at risk because of the failures to correct the course of the economy, to address the structural inequalities that the pandemic has laid bare. So now, intergovernmental organizations and civil society organizations are calling for global solidarity, for multilateral action in ways that really we can correct the systemic failures of the economy. Social justice and human rights philanthropy responded to the crisis through different strategies. There's excellent analysis and data produced by Candid and by other organizations about philanthropic responses, so I won't really elaborate on that. But I wanted to highlight a couple of trends. What social justice philanthropy mobilized to set up funds and collective pools of funds targeting communities most affected. Women's funds and funders' collectives mobilized resources to protect the women and girls in those communities most excluded. Indigenous rights and workers' rights funds were set up. They focused on the resilience of the communities. And understandably, the majority of these funds were really looking at the short-term impact of the pandemic and the most urgent sort of consequences of it. But some initiatives really went farther and looked at the longer term. For example, FORGE, the Funders Organized for Rights in the Global Economy, which is a collective co-founded by Wellspring and other funders, set up 2 funding pools, one for the short-term responses and other funds for supporting organizations that were looking at advancing issues related to the systemic change that was needed in the economy. So there was a combination of strategies and practices. Many funds were dedicated to attend those communities. However, according to data from Candid as well, in response to the pandemic, US philanthropy gave $27.4 billion in grants globally, but only $3.4 billion went to support human rights work. And most of this support remained in the North, and only 1.48% went to organizations working on human rights in the Global South. Gender justice organizations and feminist economists responded to the pandemic organizing, mobilizing, coordinating, developing policy proposals for gender just economic recovery. They gathered critical evidence, designed national action plans, scorecards, everything. And they did that with very little resources. Similarly, human rights organizations who work on economic and social rights were advancing proposals to change the economy from a rights-based perspective. So what can be done to support these efforts in the longer term? The Wellspring's strategic planning process coincided with the pandemic. So we had the chance and the opportunity to engage and consult around the field, to talk to representatives of organizations, gender justice movements, economic and social rights organizations. As a result of that process, over the next 5 years, Wellspring will focus its efforts, the Women's Rights Program will focus its efforts to advance economic justice around 3 priorities. First, to support the re-envisioning the economy effort, with a focus on strengthening and expanding feminist thinking to advance gender just post-pandemic economic recovery. The second priority is to support efforts to mobilize resources to guarantee socioeconomic rights, with a focus on increasing mobilization of public resources to guarantee women's economic and social rights. And the third priority is to support initiatives to strengthen the field of women's economic justice and increase support for cross-movement alliances for collaboration, with a focus on forging stronger links between women's rights, economic justice, natural resource rights, climate justice fields. And of course, we will do so by working with others within the foundation and also across foundations. Finally, because I think my time is up. No? Thank you. Finally, let me share 5 recommendations that emerged from the consultation that could help guide human rights grant-making efforts to advance economic justice for women. First, and it's really very much in line with what Akwasi has been proposing, it's support and sustain transformative economic justice work, adopt that intersectional approach to break the silos in philanthropy, maintain movement-building approaches and support efforts to build cross-movement alliances, support constituency-based organizations that are closer to the most affected by the pandemic, and maintain or increase flexible and longer-term funding support. I can unpack a little bit each of these recommendations if there's appetite for it afterwards. So I want to just end on a higher note, on a more hopeful note, actually. Women's movements are more vibrant than ever, and they are teaching us different forms of philanthropy, different ways of doing philanthropy. There is transnational and intergenerational feminism that is growing, and they are linking struggles for freedom, for justice, climate, and a new economy in really exciting ways. So this energy deserves increased support. And it's also hopeful to see that the human rights philanthropy ecosystem continue to become more and more diverse, thanks to the inclusion of funders that are supporting different rights for all, across all the spectrum of the human rights field. And that's a trend that gives us a lot of reason for optimism. One example of it is the new strategy of the Human Rights Funders Network. That's an illustration of that evolution. You will have Ana Maria Enriquez tomorrow, and I think that would be an opportunity to learn more about the great work of the Human Rights Funders Network as well. So thank you.
Okay, and Gara.
Thank you, Larry. I'm Gara LaMarche. The bio in the book has a lot of stuff. But for these purposes, the first kind of half of my career, I was on the kind of rights activism side with the ACLU and Human Rights Watch. And for the second half, more on the philanthropic side, running the U.S. programs for the Open Society Foundations and being the president of Atlantic Philanthropies of blessed memory. My colleague Martin O'Brien from those days is here. I wanted to say, just looking out, how gratifying it is to be in a conference where the folks in the audience could just as easily be, if not more so, be on the panel. It's a very high quality of audience participation, and I'm sure that's true of those of you out in cyber world as well. And I guess, like probably for many people here, I used to be in a lot of panels, and it's been 2 years since I've been on, kind of a live panel, and I've forgotten just how deeply satisfying it is to look out in an audience of people scrolling their smartphones. So it's very nice to be back with you all. So let me just say a couple of things by way of challenges and opportunities before we get into a group conversation here. I think the first is that, and I was going to say a lot of what I might have touched on has been better said by others, and I'll kind of glance over it. But I think that it's useful to remember that the course of human progress is not inexorably forward. So yes, it is true that for those of us like me, given the generation that I am, and some of my colleagues, Ken Roth, Jonathan Fanton, others, Regan Ralph, lived through all of this, as most of you have with me, we had every reason to think, in 1989, 90, that period of time, that some, hinge of history had been turned. Doesn't look so much that way from the moment we're sitting at, but then abolition of slavery was followed by Reconstruction, was followed by, 100 years of segregation and Jim Crow. So you can have a moment that isn't, for whatever reason, seized upon or isn't sustained, and all that kind of underscores, I think, a lesson for all of us, but certainly for funders, that you have to sustain social movements and capitalize social movements, not just at moments of crisis, but inside and outside, year in and year out. I think right now, though, what troubles me a bit as I look at the current landscape is that the challenge that we face to human rights is partly the literal abuses that we have seen in such distressing number, but also that there's a more fundamental challenge on a level of values and theory to human rights than there has been in many years. In other words, it seemed to me, for most of my years in human rights activism, that the bad actors of the world at least made a point of paying lip service to human rights principles and to kind of trying to make an argument of characterizing their bad behavior in terms of fidelity to some distorted version of human rights principles. And that is increasingly not so much the case. There is a more frontal assault, I think, on the failures of human rights. Some of it is from relatively like-minded intellectuals, so that has to be engaged, and some of it is from highly self-interested actors, who are in autocratic places, whether it's Hungary or China, or whatever various forms of either illiberal democracy exist. And so there's a more fundamental kind of intellectual and theoretical challenge to human rights than there used to be. Now, one of the reasons I think that finds such resonance is that if you look at the places which have had experienced human rights transformations or revolutions, and I'm going to overgeneralize here, but in most of those places, the benefits of, a little bit like your caviar remark, the benefits were not that widely distributed. And so a country like South Africa, for instance, which I'm a little rusty on, but worked closely with Martin and others on for many years at Atlantic Philanthropies and at Open Society, there's a reason why many young people who face, a very bleak economic future, don't really think that much about human rights or haven't thought that the benefits of democracy and human rights protection have extended to them. That's true of communities in the United States. That's true of communities all over the place. I hesitate to say anything about Northern Ireland in the presence of Martin O'Brien, but I was struck there by how even years after the changes there, young people with no economic future, find it are very appealing, to turn to violence and to sectarianism. So we haven't, as a world, have not been able to deliver the gains, the material gains in the lives of real people, particularly younger people. And I think that has something to do, some significant amount to do, with the slippage that we're feeling. It's not happening in a vacuum. It hasn't been said yet, I think, but maybe it was said this morning, but I think it's important to say that the United States has moved, or had moved, from a position of being at least, sometimes hypocritical about its human rights values, but a kind of a beacon of human rights values nonetheless, to being on the cusp of, and we're still on the cusp of, being a bad actor ourselves, a very bad actor. Everybody in this room knows that none of us can any longer take for granted, that the United States itself will remain the kind of democracy we like to think of it as. It won't become an illiberal democracy like Hungary. And that's a hugely profound, whatever you think about the past record, blemished as it may be, of the United States, that's a very, very serious problem for the world. Obviously, along with that, and the Trump administration exacerbated this greatly, the kind of challenge to the post-war set of rules and consensus, so what we thought was a consensus about a rules-based order. I think the pernicious role that has been played by social media in human rights abuses around the world. I mean, when social media came upon the scene and we were all linked and networked, most of us thought of that essentially as an unalloyed good, or at least as a tool, for organizing by people who are in support of human rights and democracy. And we now know that it is very much a tool that can be used by the enemies of human rights and democracies, and we are very far from where we need to be in getting a handle on that. Now, just briefly, I want to say a little bit more of an optimistic nature. I'm usually in the position in philanthropic gatherings, despite having had my hand on the tiller of billionaires' money for 20 years or so, I'm usually in the position of being critical of philanthropy. I do think that, and this picks up a little bit on Gabby's, some of what Gabby was saying toward the end of her speech, I think actually in philanthropy, the trends are in general in a more positive direction, of more inclusivity, a broader sense of what human rights encompasses. I think some of you saw this conversation I did with Aryeh Nair that showed this morning, and I was trying to push Aryeh on this issue because I admire Aryeh deeply and greatly, but his own dominant role in on the one hand, the biggest human rights organization, Human Rights Watch, and the other hand, the biggest human rights funder, with his very highly opinionated views on economic and social rights, for instance, had a rather a suppressive impact, in my view, on the rest of the field. But something he doesn't quite cop to, understandably. But just as we're not a unipolar world, in the global sense, we're not a unipolar world in the funding sense anymore. There's a much wider range of funders across a range of what are considered human rights, with a broader sense of what human rights are, with more participatory approaches. I was glad to see Akwasi mention that. I'm on the board of the Fund for Global Human Rights, which is a prominent example of that. The women's funds around the world have led in that. Even private foundations like the David Rockefeller Foundation, where I was a trustee for a while, devolved some of its grant-making authority to impacted communities in criminal justice work, just gave the money over for former prisoners and their families to decide how to give it out and to give it out. And I think that increasing steps toward a kind of a decentralization of philanthropic power, which, by the way, the Open Society Institute, as you'll hear more tonight, perhaps from Mark Malloch Brown, has been doing in various ways in the structure of its philanthropy for years. That, I think, is really very encouraging. And the big obstacle to that is that not enough funders, and probably they're outside this room and not inside this room, are willing to take the risks of the loss of control that comes with giving support to indigenous-led funds. The kind of power factor, the not invented here factor, all those kinds of things, particularly with big philanthropies, remains a huge obstacle. I'll stop.
Wow.
So I thought that was the whole, all four conversations were extraordinarily rich, so rich that my instinct is to just want to think about it now. But I think I'm required to keep talking, or at least try to get us to keep talking. And I also found it very somehow encouraging, which is not usually these days is not my normal mode. Because, first of all, just to make a quick observation, it seems to me there is a sort of common theme among all four, and we didn't plan this ahead of time, we just wanted each one, there is a common theme, which is that human rights has not been speaking to, let alone actually giving aid to the people who are most in need of it. Whether it's women or, as Akwasi said, people in the midst of a conflict zone, the poor, marginalized people, people who have no access on their best days to justice, no access to any of the things that the human rights movement has talked about. So it seems like there's an agreement on that among everybody. And the question is, so one question is, how do you change that? I mean, how do you do? And underneath that, there's a question that at least I'm sort of a little obsessed with, and in my experience, and I didn't, Jessica was kind enough to introduce me. I didn't say much about my own experience, but I had come to human rights out of the desire to make a revolution. That's the first thing. I'm old enough that I came of age in the middle to late 60s. And seriously, I mean, I'm not making a joke, we thought about the whole thing needs to be overturned. And my role model was not Lenin or Che, it was Martin Luther King Jr., who in 1968 said we need to completely restructure the way the society is set up in order to redistribute not just income but power to the people who are powerless. And to me, because I came out of a poor family, that was it, And we thought we could make the revolution. And then, of course, we didn't. It ended up, And human rights, in a way, seem to offer a vehicle of power that would give power again. Why? Because, and I think this is what a lot of people hoped for or got interested in it. I mean, a lot of people, I'm sorry to go on and on, but let me push this. A lot of people, in my experience, especially, for example, the people who were involved with liberation theology in Latin America, were very skeptical of human rights. They thought it was a Western, maybe in Africa also, they thought it was a Western colonial thing. It didn't speak, as we were just been talking, it didn't speak to the most needy, the poorest. That's what they were very oriented toward. But then they saw it had some power. If you used human rights language, you could get a lot of supporters all over the world who were suddenly backing what you were trying to do. And you could get governments, even if they were hypocritical, they at least had to sort of, respond in human rights. And so they began to use human rights more and more. They saw it as not as a tool that could be used to liberate the most oppressed. That's I'd be happy to hear if you all have different impressions. And that grew, that sort of built on itself. The more people thought that, the more they pushed, the more people who were not themselves poor and needy and marginalized, or were not women, they were men. But they thought, well, yeah, we can support these people and we can push governments. And it seemed to really work. That's the 70s and 80s. It seemed you had governments that said, even if they didn't want to talk to you, even if they didn't want to talk to Amnesty International, for example, they had to write a letter saying, no, we're not violating human rights. We may have a different concept, but we believe in human rights. And no, of course we believe that women should have equality. And of course we believe. They didn't really. They had no political will, but they thought that. So, and what's happening now, I think you said this, Gara, is they know there seem to be more and more governments who say, we don't really care about this stuff. You can talk about human rights all you want.
Or our model
Go ahead.
works and yours doesn't.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, that's the argument of China, for instance.
Yeah, okay. We have a better model of human rights than you. But we don't care about this international system that came out of the crisis, even worse than what's happening in Ukraine, of course, that made the world sort of suddenly say, we got to do something radically different here, and let's come up with rights that apply. Go ahead, respond.
But no, it's not a response, but I think that, Larry, that also speaks about one of the challenges that I do think that the human rights movement has these days, or one of the shortcomings, if you want to put it that way. I think that when the human rights movement started in the 70s or the 80s or whatever, you had like a very small group of human rights advocates, right? That, let's say, 5% of the population, and they were trying to persuade 80% of the population, and they were trying to reach out to these 80% of the people out there with a human rights message, right? What you have today is a world where actually, depending on the moment and the country, you have like between 45 and 55% of the people support human rights, right? But the human rights movement, instead of trying to persuade the other half, is trying to make the half that already thinks about human rights to be more committed to human rights. So it's trying to make the 50% sounds more like the 10% that it's deeply committed with the human rights movement. So I actually think that there is something about who are we speaking to as a human rights movement, right? That is very different today than at the beginning when this movement began.
Just if I can just talk back for a second. Isn't it also, what is it that human rights gives to those people that you would like the human rights movement to reach out to more? Like Gabi was talking about, you have a very vibrant, I couldn't agree more, one of the few movements that sort of gives me hope on a regular basis is the women's movement, because I see it kind of like, but what is it that human rights gives to those people? And if it doesn't give anything, then who cares? I mean, why are we, and so I'm asking the question to everybody, what is it that human rights would give? If you all have talked about reaching out, and I really, Kwasi, I want you to weigh in on this. We've all talked about reaching out to the most marginalized, the most oppressed, and in the worst situations, in the case of what Kwasi was talking about, the conflict zones. But what are we reaching out to them with? If the international human rights system is increasingly being disregarded, governments don't take it seriously, it gives us all in this room a lot of career opportunities. I teach kids at Hunter who all think it's this is a great, I can get a job, but what does it give to these people that you're talking about? So I'd like to hear everybody sort of say a word about what they think human rights. You could be working for women and girls and equality without talking about human rights. You sort of are saying you are working sometimes at the Ford Foundation without talking about human rights. So should we just get rid of this whole thing? But then what are we replacing it with? Because my argument is it was an extremely powerful, important idea. And if we lose it, I don't know what's going to take its place. I'd like to hear, maybe Kwasi, you could start.
Yeah.
What do you think you
very
give
briefly.
to the people you're talking about?
Very briefly, I think, there are three fundamental values of human rights for everyone. The first, of course, is dignity and respect. Their humanity is really focused on that they are treated with equity, with respect, with dignity. And that counts. It counts across cultures. It counts across time. Even the enemy wants respect and a bit of dignity. So that's one thing that's outstanding. The second is really the notion or the idea of interdependence. In the African context, we have the Southern Africa statement, Ubuntu, that Desmond Tutu and many of the anti-apartheid, including Mandela leaders, used, the concept of Ubuntu, I am because of you. And that cuts across. And that notion is very important. And the third is we're talking of values in terms of benefits to the heart, benefits to the mind, to the soul, and the spirit, not only to the mind. And, culturally, that's very important when you offer something or you discuss something in a way that elevates joy, emotional outcome, positive emotion in a person. That really helps. A few years ago, well, several years ago, I traveled to Senegal and I had a dinner meeting with Bono and the famous Senegalese musician. And um, one of the things that Bono spoke about was what I call the art of human rights. And he was talking about the One campaign, the art, A-R-T, the art of human rights, is one way that really highlights the values because they hear the music, they hear all the creative elements. I'm a poet, so one of my books came out recently, a poetry collection. Is titled, which you can find online, not to buy. I'm not campaigning for you to buy it, but the title is The Rhythms of Dignity. And Rhythms of Dignity really speaks to what I call the art of human rights. And people get it when it has that artistic, creative offering. And so those would be my my top ends, so to speak.
Somebody else. Gabby, let's do this.
Yes, so I know I think I'm in agreement with Akwasi in a lot of in many ways, and but I think what human rights offers to other movements in social justice in general, I think it's critical because it depends on two things. I mean, who is framing really human rights, and what are the voices that are saying this is human rights and the rest is outside of the spectrum.
Yeah.
And I think that is changing. Those
Yeah.
boundaries are melting, and I think that is really critical to acknowledge. And it's important because that's what really allows the human rights movement to reach out to those who were not feeling they were part of it, right? So it's happening slowly, but it's happening. I think the human rights narrative needs to be open to the narratives of justice and struggles from the movements in the South, from movements from indigenous communities. We need to adapt to those narratives and need to bring those who we feel have been out of the reach to our turf. So that I think has been happening. And the women's rights movement has a lot to do with it.
Yes.
Look, I think the traditional answer that the human rights movement has had, or the various offsprings of it have had, is that human rights offers a kind of a set of rules of the road, right? So that you're, in that way, human rights, in the minds of many, traditionally, is kind of neutral on matters of policy, right? And that, and human rights encompasses the Nazis' right to march in Skokie, and that helps the civil rights demonstrators because they're all operating under the same constitutional system in the United States, and similar arguments are made globally. And I believe very strongly in that. I mean, I always have. I think that is true. But it is, I think, far from sufficient, to mobilize marginalized people around the world to think that human rights has some value. For that to take place, and this goes back to the point that I and others in this panel have been making about the relationship of human rights to, in effect, to economic justice, the kind of substance of human rights work also has to be seen as advancing, the deepest aspirations and material conditions of people. And that, I think, there are, as been noted, many positive signs in terms of the human rights movement embracing a broader view, but I still think for many, and it's not just, by the way, at the door of the human rights movement or human rights philanthropies, it is governments, of course, that have failed to deliver. It is not, the fact that governments do not deliver these things is not solely the responsibility of the human rights movement, or even primarily this one. So, I mean, I think that a human rights, in the world in which we live, there has to be some answer to the question of, you know, of how you take on large concentrations of economic power that, in general, you know, inhibit the human rights aspirations of many. I want to say one other thing about this term. You know, this conference is called Human Rights. Human rights is in the name of a lot of these groups. When I was doing a little scan in the last 24 hours or so of some of my colleague funders, since I'm not heading a foundation anymore, I'm a little rusty on what X Foundation is doing. I found, of course, in part that many foundations are fairly opaque about what they actually do. But to the extent I could, I had Jonathan. Remember, 10 years or so ago, when I was at Atlantic, Jonathan did a study for me of the human rights funding landscape. So I just did it like anybody with a keyboard could do on the internet. And one of the things that I found is that the broad term of human rights as an umbrella is not, for many people, itself an organizing principle. I mean, human rights encompasses a lot of different movements. So there is a mass incarceration movement, there is a women's movement, there is an immigrant rights movement, there's a racial justice movement in the United States, and there are analogs of that all over the world. Whether people use that umbrella, so in looking at this, I think we have to ask ourselves the question, not just do folks fly under a flag of human rights, broadly speaking, but, you know, what flag are they flying under that may be of more immediate and direct interest to them because it has to do with their own identity, their own needs, or their own rights, or their own communities, and how do you knit that up into a larger whole? I think what human rights has traditionally done is provide aspirational language, and all movements need that, in a broader umbrella. We can't simply be a connection of disconnected rights movements, but I do think that if you go to the level of more focused movements, you find that there is a lot of passion, and there is a lot of people who find who may not be using the umbrella term, but are definitely human rights leaders and activists.
Yeah, I would think you would want to. You could build on that.
Yes, very much aligned with what has been said already. But I would say, like, if we want to get serious in terms of being more responsive to people who so far have very limited access to human rights, I would say that the first thing that we need to do is to listen to them, not talk to them. We are very good at talking to people, etc. I think that the human rights movement needs to do much more listening than talking, right? So, and in that sense, this humbleness needs to come with the idea that, yes, human rights is a toolkit that can be used to do a bunch of different things, but we don't need to lead with human rights. And I think that there is some sort of confusion related to, you know, the centrality of human rights and the centrality of the human rights movement with human rights progress. I actually think that there can be a lot of human rights progress without the centrality of the human rights movement, right? And that's where we definitely need to get better, right? So at the end of the day, if this is about human rights work, this is about human rights progress, you know, the traditional human rights organizations can do, and the traditional human rights funders can do a much better job just basically trying to, you know, accompany the processes that are already going on and seeing what human rights can add into those processes rather than trying to transform everything into a human rights fight.
Yeah, just to push back a little, I mean, I think the problem right now is that we're not seeing a lot of the other human rights progress, the call it human rights. I mean, I'm not anyway. Maybe you are. I don't know. I don't see it. I mean, I see the world not getting, since people stopped using the language as much, and in my opinion, they're not using it as much. Know, but I haven't seen inequality going down. I haven't seen, you know, democracy flourishing. I haven't seen poor people getting more power. I mean, so that's my first reaction to that.
But I don't think that.
I don't think I have no fetish about the words human rights.
No, but I think that why do you connect those two things. Why do you think that the fact that it's not going to have to do with, like, why are you separating and that and then putting, oh, no, we need human rights because when we had human rights, we had progress and now we don't have our...
No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that, I don't want to get into it. Maybe it's entertaining, I don't know. See Martine and I fight. But I want to go back to what Akwasi said, because to me, it's not a question of the words human rights. I mean, they don't mean anything. It's what's behind them. I mean, the idea that he was talking about of the dignity that each of us have inside us, the idea of human rights, not the phrase. The phrase means nothing. But the idea that every human being is equal to every other human being because they have an inherent dignity, and the rights are in them. They're not something that came down from the UN and came down from the Declaration. It doesn't, that. And when people, just let me tell one story before. I used to support a group, which I still think is one of the better groups I ever supported, called the Border Network for Human Rights. And they got started working with people who were on the border, who were undocumented. And the usual approach of human rights groups working with those people was to come and explain to them, to teach them. And there were all kinds. I could have funded, half my budget could have gone to people who were teaching people about human rights. The Border Network would go in and say, what do you need? What do you need? What are you thinking? They would listen, as you said, right? And people would start talking about, well, I need a decent place to live. And somebody else would say, well, I need not to be harassed by the police every time I go for a walk. They want my papers. And I need this, and I need that. I need my, my kids to be able. And at the end of this conversation, then somebody might say, those things are things that governments have already agreed you should have. And you should have them because that's not just a need, you have a right. Anyway, it was very powerful. And my experience working with poor people, marginalized people, and I'd be interested to hear other people, was, people respond very, like Akwasi was saying, they respond to that kind of language. So my question is, why can't human rights, why are the people who have human rights in their title or human rights funds, why are we not able to communicate to that? I myself tried once thinking, I spent a whole bunch of years getting a theological education because I thought I gotta understand religion, because this is not a legal thing. This is, as the way Akwasi was like, this is like a religious thing, I feel. But I'm not sure about that either. But anyway, I'd like to hear. Well,
yeah,
sorry, Kwasi.
Go ahead, Kwasi.
I see Martin has pointed to Gara. Gara, go ahead and I'll come after you.
Please, go ahead.
Well, I basically think both of you are right. I don't think it's opposing views. You are both right because, as Martin said, there's a lot of talking and less of listening. So that is correct, and that is something to address, and listen more rather than talk more. But the second part, which I think is also right, is that there has to be communication. Communication is not just about listening, it's also about talking, and it's about how you talk and what you talk about. There's always the three elements of text, context, and texture or tone. How you say it, what you're going to say, and in what context it's being said. That's when it becomes either meaningful or even offensive. That's how it works. And, communication is a very complicated thing. The famous Irish writer, George Bernard Shaw, once wrote that the single most serious problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. So we talk, and we think they've heard us the way we want them to hear us. But how we say it and what we are saying will make them think, oh, really? Okay, to hell with human rights then. That's not for me. It's not for my culture. So I think you're both right.
You know, it's a question, and you asked a version of it, and I'm sure you want to go, widen the circle of conversation shortly. But of what is the human rights language or framework, get you? And I'm not sure any longer that I quite understand the answer to that. I'll have to think about it more, and this is making me think about it more. But I'm not usually in the position of being who could be a Pollyanna right now. But in the United States anyway, and I think this is true in much of the world, but certainly in the United States, we've been living in the last 5 years or so in a time of vibrant social movement, more than any time since the period where you and I formed our consciousness, the Fight for 15, the Dreamers, the marriage equality movement, the movement for Black Lives, and so on. And, there have been substantial achievements of those movements. So when you say, what are the people who aren't using human rights language getting? Well, in some cases, they're getting a lot. Look what just happened in Amazon yesterday, which, by the way, didn't, or the day before yesterday, which, by the way, didn't even ally itself with any traditional labor movement. They thought that was, baggage. They weren't gonna, what did the labor movement do for them, So I think we're looking at it, we may be looking at it a little bit the wrong way. We're looking at it, what is philanthropy doing and what is the global human rights movement doing? In fact, on the ground, there's a lot of enormously exciting stuff. Maybe the human rights language is a tool for them, and maybe it isn't. You and I were involved years ago, in this issue of the U.S. Human Rights Fund and movement. There was a time, whatever it was, 10, 15 years ago, where in the Bush administration, where domestic human rights organizations in great frustration and desperation, seized upon the language and the tools of human rights language. And a lot of them, groups that never really thought of themselves as being part of a global movement, all of a sudden decided they were going to testify before the UN and use all these instruments. I don't know. I haven't checked in on it. I don't know how well that's going, actually. I think the brand is a little diminished. But that doesn't mean that on the ground, phenomenally exciting things aren't happening. So maybe we're having this conversation a little bit the wrong way.
Yeah, I take your point, and I'm happy to be corrected. Go ahead, Gabi.
Yes, I agree with that. I mean, meaning that the movements have been using the language of human rights strategically and in ways that really respond to their priorities and to their objectives and to their own context. There are spaces and places and moments in which using the human rights language makes sense and others that do not, right? So, and the other reason is also because if we have been too legalistic and normativistic, if that word exists, then movements associate many times the gaps in implementation of rights, the problems with enforcement and accountability with a defeat of human rights, because we have been talking about human rights only in normative terms, only using a very limited set of tools, only, talking about rights and courts. But when you get out of that, then, you have a really richer sort of base. And the discourse of human rights has been informing every movement in the South. I mean, the Green Wave movement in the southern cone of Latin America, the fact that they do not use, I'm not saying we're going to use the human rights mechanisms, that doesn't mean they are not informed by the core of the rights that are, this movement embodies. So I think, I'm not saying that's not a problem, but I think we need to look at that in a more nuanced way.
I'm just about to open it up.
But I think, because we are about to get into that moment that we started with a very gloom description of the situation, and now we are moving into a situation that we are optimistic about the future, and we need to put the two pieces together. So I don't think we want to get out of this room feeling that there is a lot of human rights progress out there, and I also don't want to send the message that, if we listen to people, we are going to fix all problems in the world. That's not what we are discussing here, right? I actually think that there is a real challenge in terms of democracy backsliding and human rights and increasing authoritarianism out there. And there are a lot of things that we can learn from the history that we heard about earlier today in the session this morning, right? It's like that human rights movement made a lot of key strategic decisions that, were choices and complicated choices. When you talk about, economic and social rights and area, it wasn't a decision that he made, lightly because he didn't like economic and social rights. It was an understanding of where the world was and why it was important to align with a certain moment and with a certain group in a bipolar world and making the most out of that moment. A decision that you may agree or disagree, but it wasn't a strategic decision, right? And there was a clear understanding about the world that they were into. And I actually don't think that we are making those choices today. I don't necessarily think that we have that shared understanding of the world that we are in today. I don't think we are willing to make those kind of strategic decisions. I don't think that the decision today should be, we need to take a side between the US and China. That's not what I'm suggesting here. What I'm saying is, like, can we have a sort of shared understanding about the moment that we are in and what are those strategic decisions? Let me propose two that I actually think are things that we need to get better at. The first one is we really need to relearn how to cope with authoritarian regimes. I think that many of us grew up in the 90s, et cetera, where we just didn't like authoritarian regimes and we thought that we could just confront them, and that's not the case anymore. So how are we going to be coping with authoritarian regimes? How do we learn about what we did back then in the 60s around authoritarian regimes is one thing that we need to get better at. And the second thing that I will stress is, I think that the human rights movement, and we were talking about this during lunchtime, needs to do better at strengthening democratic governance. I think that a lot of the work that we did actually ended up eroding, a lot of the legitimacy of democratic government. Not because we wanted to do that, but because, some of the messages were deconstructed or misconstructed in ways that we didn't expect it. And we need to get better at strengthening democratic governance. And I'm not sure that today, we have that clarity about, doing some of those strategic choices that are needed.
Okay. I think
Again,
I see
again,
another
I
Kwasi, go ahead.
agree.
Huh?
Yeah, again, I agree. But there's always one needs to have a balanced, analysis and about these things. Otherwise, we fall into what I call the tyranny of concepts. Decades ago, I wrote this article that came out in the Human Rights Quarterly, and it was in the context of the democratic movement or struggles in Africa. And the title was Africa, Democracy Without Human Rights. And so it's a very complicated dynamic. And I think everything that's been said is spot on. We just have to be nimble. We just have to be strategic and tactical at the same time. Otherwise, we can go on organizing and not organizing.
Okay, I just want to, I could go on. I myself am very energized, but I want to make sure everybody else is. And also I want to bring other people into this. I think, and plus you're all invited to the next conference, which will build on all of this. Building a new human rights movement is how I see it. That's built on the movements that are really fighting for human rights. But let's take questions from, and I think you had your hand up. Well, we have a lot of people, so can you help me? That's you first. And say who you are and.
Yes, Julia Emtseva, a PhD candidate at now currently NYU School of Law. I'm very happy that I'm the first because my questions are related to the first part of your panel. So then we could actually delve into more complex questions of what human rights are. So I have three very brief questions to most of the panelists, and I will start with what Mr. Aidoo said with regards to criticism of human rights philanthropy, and that there is this bias that of interference of private foundations in human rights, etc. And I'm wondering where this bias actually comes from, and whether you think that more universal regulation of private donations can actually help to solve this problem of this bias. And also you've mentioned that private foundations are considered or are seen as Western colonialists in those countries where they're operating, who promote their traditions, values, etc. And I'm also interested to what extent this actually is taken seriously inside of the foundation, this concern. And I think maybe you can reflect as a member of Ford Foundation how the foundation tried to combat this. My second question is to Ms. Aguilar. You spoke about women's rights and the role of philanthropy there. And I'm wondering how to respond to the issues of women's rights in countries that impose restrictive regulation and legislation on funding of certain issues. Like, for instance, in Ireland, one cannot donate money to some activist work for abortion, right? So how to avoid this criticism of being selective, which women's rights to support? And the last question is to Mr. Abregu. It relates to the authoritarian state funding. So I'm wondering to what extent you actually pay attention to the risks of those organizations who are based in these countries, because they're also risking being either closed by their countries if they are getting private money from foundations, from foreign private money, or they are risking being labeled as foreign agents, like in Russia. And yeah, I'm wondering to what if you are assessing this risk.
So I don't work for a foundation. Let's respond to that. We have 3 questions there, so.
No, I wasn't asked the questions. I'm going to the bathroom.
Huh?
Well, we work on across the spectrum of women's rights, and the importance of, I think, of listening to the movements, as it was been saying here, in working with local women's funds and with a variety of different actors, is that it gives you, and it gives foundations that are not local foundations, the perspective that they need to prioritize and to intervene in program in ways that really make sense for that specific group or for that specific community, for those communities. So I think all the women's rights, all the human rights and all the sets of rights are critical and are important. The economic justice dimension of all the other freedoms are really the issues that I'm dealing with and trying to support. But I think my main point here is we work with a variety of local re-granting organizations and groups that really have a strong sort of sense of what the priorities are, the types of rights that are, the priorities for those communities. So that's, I think, what I'll say about it.
So I will jump into this question of authoritarian state funding. I actually think that's one of the key questions, one of the most difficult one, and one that we are still grappling with in terms of all its implications. Like 5 years ago, I think we put together an internal report about grant making in challenging contexts, basically. And basically it says like we needed to do things radically different than what we were doing there because of many of the reasons that you stress. And even that report today looks outdated, and we need to adjust a lot to the bunch of things that we were suggesting 5 years ago that we needed to adjust. So it continues to change, and it's one of the most important challenges that we face. And I would put it both ways. I think that when we talk about how do we work in authoritarian countries, it's both about how you are kind of defensive or be careful or do not. And the other thing is like, okay, what do we mean in terms of when do we need to be able to have a more proactive approach to engage with, in those countries in a meaningful way. It cannot be only being defensive, right? So like you need to be defensive and proactive at the same time, but in both cases, you really need to acknowledge what this authoritarian context mean. So in that sense, we at Ford, I would say, like, basically our comparative advantage is that we have our offices and our approach is super decentralized. So people on the ground are going to be the ones guiding us around the questions that you face. And actually, that is a huge question to even today at Ford with program officers in New York or in some other countries trying to make global grants and people on the ground saying like, hey, before you make that global grant, let's discuss it with us, right? Because whatever you do at that global level has huge implication for us. And so it's very complicated to really get it right. And we are spending a lot of time in conversations that we didn't used to, right? But we want to be super clear that we cannot make a grant that will have an impact in a region without listening to the people in that region. So that's kind of a comparative advantage that we have. The last thing I would say is like, it's not only about grantees. We need to all be very clear that foundations are in many places no longer welcome nor protected. So it's not, so when we are there, we are also at risk, but ourselves. It's not just them that are at risk. So we also need to be very mindful of that because that is very different than, let's say, 30 years ago.
The question asked about the bias is very
Yeah.
important, and
Yeah.
it comes from three sources. The first is authoritarian regimes that always think, oh, this is an effort to achieve regime change and disrupt us and get us out of power and so on. That we know, and it's already been spoken about. The second is the local organizations themselves, civil society organizations and non-governmental organizations. And, there is a perception, and Gara already mentioned this, it's not even a perception, it's a reality, of what I call projectitis, the syndrome of projectitis. You come in, you find a project, you get a report, and okay, bye-bye, or maybe we'll renew it. Not enough support for sustainability, for organizational support, and so on. The Austrian philosopher Friedrich von Hegel once said in a letter to his niece, the golden rule is to help those you love to escape from you. Do we do that? There's a perception that a lot of human rights funders do not do that. This syndrome of projectitis, a project. That's another source of the bias and anger. The third, the other, of course, is regarding the NGOs, local organizations, is the competition with the international NGOs. I've heard many times that, they're sending all their money to all these big international organizations that are speaking on our behalf. And so that's one source from the NGOs. When I was heading the Ford Foundation office in Nigeria for West Africa, the first time I arrived, there was a protest by the human rights organizations, a group of them, led by CLO and CRP, two of the oldest human rights organizations in Africa. CRP is Civil Rights Project, and CLO is the Civil Liberties Organization. And they were protesting, and you know what it was? They said, the road to me, we will never again seek funding from the Ford Foundation. And to make it short, it was all about, you just create emission drift for us. You don't even listen to us. Martin Abregu's point about listening, you don't even listen to us, on and on and on. And it did change. We changed our strategy and our tactics as a result. So if you're not listening carefully, that's what you get. And then the third and final source of the bias is, of course, the media. But time is running, so I won't go into details on that.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
You're
Hi.
clear. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Kalia Miller. I'm the Deputy Director of Human Rights Funders Network. Gabby, thank you for mentioning us. I will be sharing some of the data tomorrow that sheds light on this discussion as well. But one of the things that struck me was missing from the conversation is not just what's in our funding ecosystem, but how much resourcing is going against rights and rights work at this moment. And I was wondering if you could speak to that and the fact that anti-rights movements are organized, they're resourced in all the ways that we have been trying to get our own movement to resource ourselves. We've talked about flexible funding, core support, fast coordinated funding. They're doing that. Are we missing the boat? How are you seeing that in your own institutions? And what kind of nuance can we have in these discussions without bringing that kind of critique to separate our own work and actually having the same sort of narrative unity that we're seeing in the anti-rights funding space?
Yeah. Anyone want to respond? I mean,
I'm not affiliated with an institution. But I will say that that's, I mean, so I don't have the answer in this context because I'm a little rusty on it. But I mean, having just come off 7 or 8 years heading a group of progressive political donors in the United States, we spent a lot of time thinking about the money that was against us and what we were, and how to learn. In fact, in many respects, the kind of progressive response in recent years was based on a close study of what the right wing was doing. And I have to say that it's a really good question because in my days as a human rights funder, I don't think I paid enough attention to that. So I'm very interested to hear what those of you who are human rights funders are thinking about it.
yeah, I just wanted to say that this question is not unrelated. It's not just a question of, you know, how so-called human rights funders should be more flexible and give better. It's in a way the anti-rights people and the rights people are both competing for some of the same people that Martine was talking about and Gabby was talking about and Kwasi was talking, we're all talking about, which is that being against authoritarianism is more than just outspending them, or it's understanding what is the message that they're using that grabs people, because we know that it's not just that these people have imposed by sheer violence or terror. I mean, now in the Ukraine maybe, but in places like Hungary where the guy just won, you know, a big majority, there's something going on that human rights funders and human rights advocates need to begin to understand. And in this country as well, we know that some support for the anti-rights people here are coming from people who are marginalized and who are not the most marginalized. Mostly they're largely, you know, probably white men, but they are poor, and we're somehow not putting out a message. So I just wanted to add to your concern about how funders are thinking, for funders to be thinking about how are we funding messaging that could, and how are we ourselves putting out messaging, because you have a huge megaphone at the Ford Foundation, for example, or OSF. That's so okay, Felice. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll get to you next. So first her, and then Felice, and then.
Thank you, Larry. You mentioned dignity, and of course the Universal Declaration starts referencing dignity and free and equal. Everyone is free and equal in dignity and rights is in the first substantive right. That got in there because the Catholic Church insisted that it be in there, and you told us about your theological training as well. I wouldn't want us to go through the day without at least asking the question, where does organized religion or unorganized religion, if you look at some of American evangelicals and so forth, how does that fit into the human rights movement? It was an ally in the 70s in Latin America, in some parts of Latin America. It was an ally in other fights that were taken. Today doesn't look, to me, doesn't look like it is, but I'm wondering how the panelists feel about that as a factor in trying to address the current challenges and opportunities.
Not an easy question to answer in a minute.
Well, just briefly, I think that in the United States, which I know better, the mainline Protestant denominations that, for instance, formed the National Council of Churches, which in general was an ally to the social and human rights movement, are all for various reasons on the wane and have elderly, dying, undiverse, congregations. And the Catholic Church always has been a kind of a mixed bag. I mean, it's still the case. Well, no, I mean, I say this as a lapsed Catholic. I'm a subscriber to the National Catholic Reporter, as it happens, so I know that the immigrant rights movement and the mass incarceration movement and so on, the Catholic Church in the United States and globally remains, I think, a very positive force in a lot of these movements, but where anything having to do with women's rights and LGBT rights are concerned, not so much.
Anybody else want to take this on? I would say myself that it's also a question of not just trying to, usually when human rights people want to recruit religious organizations now, or the official human rights organization, they think it's just a question of like transactional thing. But I don't think that's what we need. I think we need to be able to speak to people in the way we've been talking that touches their most deep religious impulses. And they may not even be organized in a church anymore or a synagogue or a mosque, but that's a very powerful language, and it goes back to this messaging. How do you begin to talk in a way that people know that you're not giving them legalistic or old language that we've used for 50 years now and no longer has any power, but that you find, and dignity is, I think, to me, is a key part. People respond to it. I mean, I keep thinking of the old Martin Luther King campaign in Memphis, where everybody had a sign. Okay, they were all men, so the sign was "I am a man." That was all it said, but it was extraordinarily powerful because it was about dignity. Okay, who's next? No, you had one back there.
Just to, oh.
Huh?
Oh.
Need a mic. Go ahead.
Okay, my name's Hosh Ibrahim. I'm from the Mo Ibrahim Foundation and a few other organizations. I was really struck by what Martin had said, actually, and just thinking about the last 30 years. And you'd said that, you started maybe 30 years ago with maybe a very small proportion of 5%, you said, who were trying to, explain to the other 95% what human rights was. And the process of this. And I was just thinking, maybe we're looking at it differently. Well, from where I stand and see it, I think that in many ways that you've won the intellectual war, we won the understanding, but now is the real war, right? It's actually to make it happen and to change the the systemic way of the power stops that happening, right? Like I'm sorry, Gabby was just saying about women's rights, for example. I don't think that there is an understanding of the need for equality for women, of women's rights around the world, that we know that there should be the right for a woman to be president, right? But can you get that in this country? Now, that then becomes a structural issue of how to go against those power systems that stop that happening, right? And that is a bigger war. It's a different thing. And I think that the understanding is there for human rights, and the understanding that, I see in places like Sudan, for example, you see these young girls who are going up against, demonstrating on the streets, and they want equality, and they want a world that's changed. Now, the hard thing is, how do you make that happen, right? And so I think it's, yes, a lot of what was been said today is that, why are people not using the words? I think in whatever language or iterations we understand it, people now are, I don't think it's 40%. I think many more than that in the world feel that, yes, civilians do have rights, and they want those rights. But the words alone aren't going to make it happen. And it's about changing, those gatekeepers that stop it. And that's a lot of why we're having this kickback, right? Because now, we've brought it out into the world of human rights, and then all these other people who might go, well, I don't think I want to give up my presidency for this woman, or I want to allow this black man to have this role, or whatever that may be, right? That's the harder battle, and that's the next level. And I think it doesn't mean that it's stopped. It's just that it's going to a different gear, I think. And I'd be interested in how the panel feel about that, and how do we accept that and not get depressed about it.
Okay. Yeah, I think when you get beyond the words, you also get into the question of power, which is something that we could talk about, but not maybe on another occasion. Go ahead, Gabby.
Yes, no, thanks. I think that's a really great sort of question, and prompts that issue we've been talking about how we have been approaching human rights to people, and whether human rights has really responded to all those levels of needs of people in their daily lives. And it's striking that economic and social rights, which is really the set of rights that speak more closely to the realities and lives of people, has been neglected for so long. Larry, you're a pioneer in that field. We've been following your steps all the time. So I think that is really, that should give us a lot to think about. And it's the same way. I mean, when we talk to a woman who has specific needs and livelihoods, and we tell them what to go to a development agency or to get grants from other places. No, I think that's exactly what is the type of transformative sort of grant making we need to do. Really, that it speaks to the realities of women, and not just women. I mean, people at the micro level, but at the same time empower them to really influence at the macro level. It's really challenging. Those who are ready and have tools to support organizations that work at the macro level on debt, trade, fiscal policy, sometimes are not tooled to reach out and to work with those on the ground. And I think that's what we're trying to build. So a whole sort of ecosystem of regranting organizations that can really reach out to women. And at the same time that respond to their livelihoods and daily needs, you're helping them mobilize, organize, gaining consciousness, and really elevating their voices so that the macro level advocacy really makes sense and it's grounded on their reality. So that I think it's, at least for us, what we've been hearing from the ground.
Okay, I just want to make sure we get all the questions we got. So Hani, you.
Thanks, Larry. I wanted to sort of, because we're talking about the challenges facing human rights philanthropy, and part of the discussion is obviously on the state of the human rights movement, etc. But the other part of the discussion is also the philanthropists and the donors, and I think what we're seeing is a shrinkage in funding to human rights groups around the world. Leave the United States out of the picture for a minute, but if you look around the world, we're seeing a shrinkage. And if I look at the region I know the best, Middle East and North Africa, you're definitely, and there's several reports out, I can share links with people on that issue. Part of the problem, I mean, in recent years has been this so-called war on terror, which has really tied up the donors in knots in terms of, how do we get money to organizations on the ground in situations where we can't 100% be sure the money is not finding its way to terrorist organizations. And it's not obviously helped by governments who call human rights activists terrorists or call their opposition terrorists, etc. And that really needs focused attention. In the past, the problem used to be the governments would basically pass laws that made it difficult for donors to be able to support human rights within their countries, and we came up with some ways as donors to deal with that. But now we're seeing also a picture of quite a few activists have had to leave their countries and work from abroad. Yeah. And they're not getting the support because many of the philanthropists and many of the donors want to be supporting grassroots, meaning inside the country on the ground. And the ones who have had to leave because they can't continue to operate inside the countries are struggling, and I think that's another one to be focusing on and finding new ways to provide support. And then there's a third area which is not directly related to that, but I think more and more, and Felice brought it up this morning, we're seeing a lot of focus on perpetrators and bringing perpetrators to justice, and less on supporting victims and survivors, particularly in conflict situations. And I think that has to be looked at. Justice, is broader than just criminal justice. And if you talk to and listen to the people on the ground, the victims and the survivors, they're not necessarily saying criminal justice is number one. They're saying we need help today to survive in the conflicts that we are living in today. The refugees who need the displaced who need help, etc. And they're seeing a lot of the funding going to criminal justice and less so to support them in their situations. Thanks.
Yeah, Jonathan, you want to comment on that first? Anybody want to comment?
I'm happy to wait. I comment on
Yeah.
that, but I'm happy to
I'm
wait.
just worried about running out of time.
Ready?
Why don't you get whatever more questions you want?
We got 5 minutes, so.
Picking up a legal pad, it makes me
So I'm going to pose a kind of question that is for all of us, not just for the four of you. And it's something we can come back to in the panels tomorrow. But as we think about this conference and what brings us together, I think we share a hope that more, not less, would be invested in human rights. I think we share a hope that the source of funding for human rights will broaden, diversify, not just be U.S. and Europe and so forth, but spread around the world. I think we share a hope that the money will be invested wisely. And that's not so easy. We've spent a fabulous panel and all the things you've talked about. But then how do we think about what it boils down to in terms of a practical decision? And then finally, I think we all share a hope that we want to make a difference. We want more money, we want it invested wisely, and we want to make a difference. And so I think we need a kind of narrative about where we are kind of in the arc of history. And we need, let me use the words, some benchmarks. I'm avoiding the impact word, but some benchmarks so we know that we're making some progress. And I'm thinking, as I'm listening to all this, if I'm talking to the board of a large foundation, or if I'm talking to a individual new philanthropist, how do I make the case for more wisely in a way that will make a difference? And I don't expect that to be answered in 3 minutes.
I'm not going to answer, but I'm going to sum up, I think, because I have, I think, 3 minutes or 2 minutes, depending on how accurate my cell phone is. And I just wanted to say that, to me, there's also another question, which is how we think about what is needed by human rights funders, which is not to think so much about, and this is my, you correct me, you my fellow panelists, not so much to think about how do we fund human rights, but how do we fund the rights of the people who are most marginalized, oppressed, whatever you want to put it, who need it the most. How do we organize, how are we funding them so they can fight for their rights? And how do we organize their power so that they can begin to change it? I think it's a slightly different way of thinking about it. The one may lead you more and more to look to which groups have the flag, what we talked about, the human rights, and then okay, and then we may try to change those groups to do better or less on. But the other one looks at where are the people who are being totally screwed by systems, totally screwed by conflict, totally screwed, and how do we build their power so they can live, first of all, and then how they can begin to rebuild their lives. And I think that's an interest, for me, that's an interesting way to think, and also a hopeful way to think, because I haven't been myself, speaking personally, in the last months, very hopeful, but this conversation actually helped, And so in terms of my own personal therapy, I want to thank all four of our great people, and I hope it also helped the rest of us to start thinking, and also we can build on it, I think, in keeping this conversation going in the next